This presentation, we're going to be looking at the relationship between organisms and temperature. Temperature is one of the most important environmental factors and one of the most relevant in the face of today's rapidly changing climate. Why are they so important? Well, the fundamental importance of temperature to organisms, including you and I, is because the temperature is going to impact the rate of the chemical reactions in your body. So this is extremely important to the individual organism in order to maintain cellular respiration, to construct our proteins, for plants to do photosynthesis. And we're going to see throughout this chapter that all organisms are best adapted to a fairly narrow range of temperatures in which our chemical reactions can occur. And this is really defined by the enzymes that govern the rate of our chemistry. And these enzymes are proteins which work best in a narrow range of temperatures. So this is chapter 5 in the textbook Ecology, Concepts and Applications, written by Molles and Sher and published by McGraw Hill in 2019. I am Susan Glenn, and this is part of the lecture series for my ecology class. Okay, if we look at this really pretty little yellow plant in the front of this Arctic tundra picture, that particular plant is Dryas integrifolia. And living in the Arctic tundra, obviously temperature is an important aspect of the Arctic environment. And if we're going to be talking about temperature, it probably makes sense to take a little bit of time to talk about what it is we're actually measuring. And temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy, the energy of motion of molecules in a substance. So obviously if the molecules are moving faster, pushing each other around more, they have more energy, that gives you a higher temperature. So the kinetic energy is generally referred to as heat energy or simply as heat. And it is one of the most ecologically significant factors. So when you think about going up here in the Arctic tundra, maintaining a body temperature so that you can run your chemical reactions is going to be critical, and you need to maintain that for as long as possible. You can see that these little plants don't get to grow very big because there is a limited amount of energy available for a short growing season, and the sun is rather weak. It is not high above the horizon at any point in the Arctic. So they talk about, your textbook, they talk about a study in Ellesmere Island, which is very north in the Northwest Territories of Canada, 82 degrees north. Remember the North Pole is at 90 degrees north. And this is a researcher named Peter Kevin, went there in the summer, and what he had noticed was that as the sun moved across the sky during the day, the flowers tracked it like a satellite dish tracking a satellite. These flowers would track the sun in order to capture in sort of their parabolic shape, capturing that sunlight. And there would be close to 24 hours of sunlight every day, and these flowers would just keep their flower pointed towards it. That would heat them up and heat up their reproductive structures. So the flower is the reproductive organs of the plant. And it also attracted the pollinators, which are little insects that like to sit in those little warm flowers and go from flower to flower, and it would pollinate the flowers, and that way they could sexually reproduce. So here you can see the pretty little Dryas flowers, and the light gets reflected and focused inward on the reproductive parts of the flower. So if the air temperature is 15 degrees Celsius, the temperature inside the flower is significantly higher at 25 degrees Celsius. And the insects can sit there and bask and warm up so that they can get the energy to fly to the next flower. So microclimate, we've talked about microclimate a little bit. Microclimate is where the local landscape is going to affect the temperature. And when we were talking about the biomes, we were talking about the large macroclimate, which is the prevailing weather conditions in a region over a long period of time. Microclimate is the variation in the climate on the scale of a few kilometers or meters, or in some cases even centimeters, usually measured over short periods of time. So you understand microclimate if you've got standing out in the hot sun on the black parking lot, you're going to overheat. But if you move into the shade of a tree, move off that black parking lot onto the grass, you know it's going to be much cooler. So many organisms will move around, and it's going to influence their behavior, where they're going, based on the particular microclimate. And for organisms, the microclimate may be more important than the macroclimate, that you can actually find a place that's nice and warm or nice and cool in order to spend the day there. And just your physical location or your behavior. And plants have behavior too, and we'll be talking about some of the plants as we go along. And obviously, when you're going up in altitude up to the top of a mountain, we know that the temperatures are generally lower at higher elevations. And so not only is temperature changing, but atmospheric pressure is changing. And that is the reason temperature is changing. So because as you go up, the atmospheric pressure decreases, and the air is rising up the side of the mountain, it'll expand then because the molecules are going to be further apart. That means the energy of motion required to sustain the movement of the air molecules is drawn from the surroundings, and it cools them. So that expansion of the air is pulling that heat out of the ground. And the second reason temperatures are generally reduced at higher elevation is that there's less atmosphere above the sites to trap and radiate heat back into the ground. So the clouds are not sort of pushing the heat back down. So if we look at the microclimate as we go up a mountainside, this is Mount Everest on this diagram. And as we move up Mount Everest, we can see that the air pressure is lower. So the red line goes from down on the ground, at an altitude of 0 kilometers, the air pressure is at 1,000. As we go up to the top of Mount Everest, the air pressures drop somewhere around 314. And if you went up higher in a balloon, you can see you could get even to lower and lower air pressure. As that air pressure decreases, then your temperature is going to decrease as well. So macroclimate would be the large-scale variation in weather. Microclimate is a small-scale variation in the weather. In this case, we're talking about temperature. And we've just seen that if we go up in altitude, we're going to find that the higher altitudes have lower temperatures because of the lower air pressure and the lack of atmosphere to re-radiate heat. Another aspect of microclimate or another impact on microclimate is going to be aspect. And aspect is basically where you are in the landforms or the topography around you. Mountains and hillsides will shade certain parts of the land. Other parts of the land are going to be exposed to more direct sunlight. So it makes a difference whether you're standing on the sunny side of the house or you're standing on the shady side of the house. Where we live in the northern hemisphere, the shaded areas are always on the north-facing sides or the northern aspects of hills and mountains and buildings, which face away from the equator, because the sun is always to our south here. Remember, the sun will be at the most directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer. It never is directly overhead this far north. On the other side of the planet, in the southern hemisphere, the southern aspect faces away from the equator, so that is the side that receives less direct sunlight. So because of the contrasting microclimates, the northern and southern sides of mountains can support very different types of vegetation. So microclimates and macroclimates are really referring to the scale of the weather variation, and we've been talking about the microclimate impacts of temperature and altitude, that the higher the altitudes, the lower the temperatures. We can also look at topographic features such as hills and mountains in terms of aspect, not just altitude. And that one side of the hill or mountain is going to have a shady microclimate, and the other side is going to be exposed to more direct sunlight. And so that is going to influence the temperatures. On the shady side of your house is going to be cooler and warmer on the sunny side of your house. So in the northern hemisphere where we live in the uh, in the U.S., the shaded areas are always on the north side of the buildings, the hills, the mountains, and the south sides or the southern aspects are facing the sun, and that's because we are north of the Tropic of Cancer, and the sun will never be directly overhead here. It'll never be to the north of us here. It's always going to be down to the south. It'll never be further north than the Tropic of Cancer, and the opposite occurs in the southern hemisphere. So the southern aspects in the southern hemisphere are facing away from the equator, so they receive less direct sunlight. So you can see how this microclimate, the temperature is also going to be affecting the energy, the amount of sunlight, and that's obviously going to affect photosynthesis. So because of the sunny and shady side of things, these aspects will offer quite different environments over a very short space. When you just walk around the edge of a tree or a forest or a building or a hill, you can immediately go from somewhere nice and cool to somewhere that's nice and warm. So here we can see an example looking at a north-facing slope and the versus the south-facing slope. And the south-facing slope in this particular diagram or this particular landscape is the one that has very little vegetation. The north-facing slope has a lot of trees on it, and the trees are on the cooler side of the slope, so it's not going to have the snow melt as quickly in the spring, and it's not going to dry out, so there's plenty of moisture for the trees. Whereas the south-facing slope, so this side is going to be south-facing, and this side is north facing. So the sun is going to be shining directly on that south facing slope and drying it out. Okay, we see the same thing here. This is the woodlands, shrublands of the chaparral in Southern California, and we can see the same issue. We've got quite a strong contrast between a south-facing slope that is covered with grasses and it dries out and gets hot in the summertime, whereas the north-facing slope has a lot more shrub and tree cover on the left side, and that is going to stay a lot cooler throughout the day. And we can see that over a very short period, you're in completely different type of vegetation based on this change or difference in microclimate. There are other factors that are going to be influencing the temperature quite a bit, and that is whether there is any shade. The vegetation will shade the landscape, creating microclimate. Trees, shrubs, and even the fallen leaves, branches, and twigs can produce a little bit of shade in the desert. So every little bit of shade is going to count. And the desert landscapes, which have sort of a lot of wide open bare space as well as a little patchwork of vegetation, is going to have a patchwork of microclimate where things can be very, very different over a very short period, whether you are found down under these little shrubs or out in this open dirt landscape. So this is an example of looking at the microclimate where they looked in the desert to see what the temperatures were based on the location in relation to the vegetation. And we can see out here on the bare soil where you were out in the open from that last picture where there were not any shrubs, you've got a temperature out here of 48 degrees Celsius, unbearable temperature. Whereas even if you were a little insect and you were able to get down under the leaves that had fallen off of the shrub, you've dropped the temperature by 19 degrees. You're down to 28 or 29 degrees Celsius under the litter. So just crawling under the leaves makes a difference. If you get under a small shrub that's provide a little bit of shade, you can drop it a couple of more degrees. And if you're getting under a larger shrub, obviously those bunches of large shrubs is going to give you the most protection from the heat, and your temperature is going to be much lower. The color of the ground can also significantly affect temperatures. You know that if you stand on a black, fresh pavement in the summertime, it's going to feel really hot as opposed to standing on the grass or standing on lighter colored ground. And so the darker colors are going to absorb more light, and these are significant to the point that we will often characterize an area with the black volcanic sand versus the white sand, and the black volcanic sand is definitely going to hurt your feet more from the heat building up. Another example of something that's going to impact your temperature is whether you can get down into a shady burrow or whether you can hide under a boulder. Anything that's going to provide you a place underground or a place that's out of the sun is going to make a difference in your temperature. So this is some data that was taken from the Sevilleta National Wildlife Refuge in central New Mexico. This is an LTER site that's operated by the University of New Mexico. LTER stands for Long-Term Ecological Research Site. These are sites that are funded by the National Science Foundation, where they collect ecological environmental data every year in the same way. And there's a collection of these sites all over the country where they collect the same sort of information. And then scientists have a baseline of information, and they can go and apply to do research projects in addition on these particular sites. And the Sevilleta site is found in the Chihuahuan Desert. And daily temperatures in the Chihuahuan Desert will fluctuate quite a bit. If you look at these air temperatures in this diagram, going from midnight to 6 a.m., we can see they can drop down to the low 20s in the morning, and then by mid-afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they've gone up to over 35 degrees, which is unbearably hot. This is Celsius. And then late afternoon, evening starts to drop again. And so organisms being exposed to these temperatures are going to have to adjust their behavior depending on what it's like out that day. And then the soils, so if you burrow down into the soils, so let's say you're something like a kangaroo rat, you burrow down in the soils, you can see that the soil temperatures are actually much more stable throughout the day. And this was some research by some researchers at the LTER site so that you can actually see the impact of being underground. The picture across the top is a picture from the Sevilleta. That's a herd of pronghorn antelope, which is North America's fastest land animal and our only antelope in North America. Well, we know in the summer in New Jersey, when it starts to get unbearably hot, we try to go down to the shore so we can cool off with the cool ocean breezes. And we do know that water has an impact on our temperatures. So a little bit about water, and a little bit about its ability to absorb heat energy without changing temperature. That is a property uh, of uh, of substances that is known as the specific heat. So the capacity to absorb heat energy without changing your temperature is the specific heat. And the capacity for the specific heat for water is about 3,000 times higher than it would be for a certain volume of air. So it takes a lot more heat to heat up the water than it does to heat up the air. So if we look at water, 1 calorie of energy is defined as the amount of energy needed to heat up 1 cubic centimeter of water 1 degree Celsius. With the air, to heat up 1 cubic centimeter of air by 1 degree Celsius only takes 0.0003 calories of energy. So air is much easier to heat up. So air heats up during the day, cools off at night more quickly than the water does. So being close to water, the water can be absorbing a lot of the heat, and that way the water is keeping the surrounding area from heating up too much. The other thing water can do is that when water starts to evaporate, it is going to be absorbing a lot of heat. It's called the latent heat of vaporization. And this is the heat absorbed by the water as it evaporates. And that is a very important cooling mechanism. So when you get covered with water and then you come out of the ocean and stand in the breeze, the water evaporating off the surface of your skin is going to carry away heat from the surface of your skin. It also happens when you sweat. So when you sweat, you're putting water on the surface of your skin. That will evaporate away. And when it evaporates away, you're able to cool yourself off. So this is a great cooling mechanism for organisms. The problem is if you're sweating and cooling yourself by sweating and you're out in the desert, water is a limiting factor. So it's going to be hard to maintain the water you need if you're spending a lot of time cooling yourself with sweating. The last property of water that some people are not aware of, but it does give you more stability in aquatic environments, is the energy water gives to the environment as it freezes. And this is called the latent heat of fusion. And water gives up approximately 80 calories as 1 gram of water freezes. And so the energy of the motion of the water molecules decrease as they go from a liquid state into the crystalline state of the ice. So as a gram of pond water freezes, it gives off sufficient energy to heat 80 grams of water at 1 degree Celsius, and that prevents the water from continuing to cool. So that obviously is going to be an important source of energy in the wintertime as the surface of the water is freezing over. The organisms can appreciate some more heat coming that way. So the latent heat of fusion is another impact of water on temperature. So aquatic environments have a lot more thermal stability, especially the more water there is, the more thermal stability there is. But even if you have a small stream, you can find that the temperatures within the stream are going to fluctuate much less than the temperatures in the air around. And it's not just the water that's having a benefit, but there's also vegetation growing along the sides of the stream. And so we define this vegetation along stream sides as the name of riparian vegetation. So riparian areas are streamside areas, and they are protected by federal law because they're very important in maintaining the stream environment, which is also maintaining your water quality. So if we look at the way the temperature is being impacted along the side of the stream, we can see in this study the air, just the daily temperature changes in the air in this particular study was going from air temperatures around 4 degrees Celsius to air temperatures all the way up to 28 degrees Celsius. However, if you went and you were in these little reeds by the side of the stream, growing out of the stream surface, being in that shade and being closer to the water, you can see how drastically less variation. So it never got as cold and it never got as hot in those little reeds. The areas in the stream that are shallow, where the water is bubbling over the rocks, and you can see the clear water and the riffle habitat. Streams generally have riffle and pool habitats as you go down the stream. In the riffle area, where it's a little more shallow, but you're still right in the water, we can find that the temperature variation is even less. And then you get down into these deep pools in the stream. You go down into the bottom of a deep pool, and you're going to find very little variation in temperature. So we're seeing the daily variation is somewhere closer to 4 or 5 degrees instead of this broad variation we saw of something around 24 degrees variation over the course of the day. So these deep pool environments are nice and cool and stable compared to the rest of the environments around it. So riparian vegetation influences the stream temperature by providing this shade. So this is the end of section 5.1 in chapter 5 of temperature relations. And you should be able to do the 3 concept review questions at the end of the chapter. For example, you should be able to explain how the microenvironment in a dryas flower could affect other species. And then what kind of advantage does this give to your dryas flower?